guys, it's Reagan, and today I'm filming a very exciting video. This has probably been the most requested video on my channel, so I'm very excited to finally be able to sit down, plan it, and create it for you. And the video today I'm going to be doing is my beginner's guide to fantasy, or beginner fantasy recommendations. As many of you guys know, fantasy is by far my favorite genre. I just love it so much, and I get comments all the time on my YouTube channel from people who are really interested in the genre, but for whatever reason are intimidated by it and don't necessarily know where to start. Because to be fair, there's a lot of options. Many of the series are very long, and both in the number of books and the length of pages, so kind of getting into the genre itself can be a little tricky, especially if you just don't know where to start. So today I decided to make a video that kind of gives you some recommendations of really great series to start with if you're interested in getting into fantasy. This particular video will correspond with some of my fantasy favorites, but this is not a list of necessarily my favorite fantasy series of all time. I've read a lot of fantasy books. However, some of them are, and also I'm planning on making that video in a few months' time, so wait for that, because that's gonna be a real doozy. Quick side note before I jump into this video, you're gonna notice that there is an absence of some very well-known, well-loved series, specifically The Mortal Instruments, Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, and anything by Sarah J. Maas. I decided not to include them because I feel like that they're already very well known and known to be really great places to start in fantasy. So I decided to make a list that kind of perhaps would introduce some series that you weren't sure or haven't heard of as much. That being said, if you haven't read those series, those are amazing books to start with as well. I'll leave them linked down below, but I just wanted to maybe focus on some lesser known book series or some books that people might not have realized could be really great places for them to start with. Sorry about that incredibly long-winded intro. Let's just go ahead and get started. The first book I'm gonna recommend is Carry On by Rowell. So this is a particular book that's kind of between genres, which is why I think it's one of a really great places to start. Rowell is mostly known as a contemporary author, and this particular project was inspired by one of her well-loved contemporary books, which followed a character who wrote fan fiction for a well-known fantasy series in her world called Simon Snow. This is that fan fiction, essentially. This novel is that fan fiction written out in novel form. It is the 7th book of a fictional series that is very much inspired by Harry Potter. The great thing about this book series is that it definitely is character heavy, and it has a lot of contemporary elements that you're used to reading and loving in a lot of contemporary books. It still has fantasy elements like magic and world building and just magical conflict in general. But because this book is combined with a lot of those contemporary elements, it's a really easy book to just fall into and love, specifically follow these characters. It's a lot of fun, and I just really feel like this is a great introductory book, especially because I feel like in itself it is between genres, which makes it really just like an easy way to kind of ease your way in, if you will. The next few books I'm going to recommend are within a subgenre of fantasy called urban fantasy. Urban fantasy, I feel like, is another really great place to start with fantasy because it is set in our world. Essentially, urban fantasy can exist among a large timeline from the past to the present, but essentially it is set on Earth in some capacity, obviously with fantastical elements thrown in there. A very famous example of this is The Mortal Instruments. This particular genre can be really great to start out with because it can be slightly less overwhelming if you already sort of understand, for the most part, how the world works, because we live on Earth, so it can be a little helpful. The first series I'm going to recommend within this genre is the Heir series by Cindy Williams Chima. I bet a lot of you are expecting me to recommend The Demon King, which I still do. I love that series, but this is her first series, and actually the first series I ever read by her. And this is an urban fantasy series with each book following a new character that kind of comes into their own type of magical powers. It has a lot of adventure, it has a lot of character growth, and it has a lot of action, but again, it's set within our world for the most part, which makes it a lot easier to kind of get into. This was one of the books that introduced me to YA fantasy just in general, and I thought it was really, really great, and I loved it a lot, so I really feel like it can do the same for a lot of people out there as well. The next urban fantasy series I'm going to recommend is Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. This is a beautiful YA story that, again, is an urban fantasy mix. It essentially is set partially within our world and set partially in an entirely different world, which I feel like, again, can ground you to some reality that you're used to. you, but also allows you to kind of expand into the concept of entirely new world and new politics. This is a beautiful story that follows, again, multi-perspectives. It's a love story, it's a war story. Laini Taylor really successfully in this series paints a dark and harrowing war story following new types of creatures, and her main character has to grapple through generations of hatred and distrust amongst warring factions, and it's really, really beautiful. I really love this story, and it's really great. Next book I'm gonna recommend is actually middle grade, and that is gonna be Fablehaven by Brandon Mull. This is a 5-book series that I feel like kind of is in between middle grade and YA, but regardless, it's a really, really fun, really fast-paced, action-packed story that I feel like, again, is a really great place to start. This particular series follows siblings who go and stay with their grandparents during the summer, and they find out that their grandparents are in fact guardians of Fablehaven, which is a refuge for magical creatures, from everything from fairies to big beasts. At the start of this series, they're kind of thrust into adventure, and you follow them over 5 books as they grow up and get older and face larger and larger and larger problems that they have to solve. It's a lot of fun, and the thing about this particular series that makes it really nice is that the arcs of the action kind of conclude at the end of each book, obviously carrying on to the next book, but it does have that satisfying ending to it. But it still propels you to the next book in the series, which is really great. The next book I'm gonna recommend is The Kiss of Deception, which is the first book to the Remnant Chronicles. I think this is a great series to read if you haven't read a lot of fantasy, particularly because I feel like this is an amazing series for one thing. Definitely one of my favorite YA fantasy series ever, but I feel like this book series grows so nicely with each book. The world, the politics, and everything slowly get more complex with each installment. The first book is pretty narrow in scope and narrow in world. We follow our main character who runs away from an arranged marriage, and throughout this story we follow the prince she was supposed to marry, her, and an assassin who was sent to kill her, and you don't really know whose is who. But again, at the end of this particular series, the world gets cracked open into a much larger way, and the politics get a lot more expansive, but it kind of eases you into the world slowly as you first focus more solely on the characters, but from there you begin to locate and understand the larger world and the larger politics. This is probably one of my top recommendations. It's a really great story, has great characters, and I just was really impressed by it, and I really feel like this is a wonderful place to start. The next few books I'm going to recommend are really great if you're interested in reading fantasy books with multi-perspectives. These books I feel like do it really well and are also really great introductory books kind of to that style of writing, because it can get a little confusing if there's a lot of perspectives. Think Game of Thrones. I even sometimes get a little confused in Game of Thrones. I'm like, who is this again? I don't remember them. But anyway, these are the books I recommend potentially starting with. The first one is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is a really great series because we follow 6 perspectives, which is quite a bit, but each one is so unique and so loud and so wonderful to read from that it's very hard to confuse them. Also, they're all very fun to read from. They're outcasts and criminals, and the particular story itself has a pretty linear plot, so it doesn't really get all jumbled together, which again makes it very easy to follow. That being said, this book is amazing. It's a duology, and I really, really love it. It follows this cast of 6 characters as they try to complete an impossible heist. None of them are perfectly good people, but none of them are actually really that bad of people either. You root for them, you like to see them make mistakes, but you like to see them grow from those mistakes. This is a really great series that's set in a very interesting fantasy world inspired by different historical eras, and it's really, really cool, and I would highly recommend this. The next multi-perspective series I recommend starting with is Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. This is kind of how I would describe Game of Thrones and a young adult version. These books are significantly shorter than a lot of things that you see in adult fantasy, but there are multiple perspectives with multiple different storylines from different lands that all kind of tie together. It is a complex plot line and storyline that extends itself over multiple books, but it's not so complex that you get very confused in it, and again, the books themselves are not very long, so the plot itself feels very easy to follow. However, this is a great series to start with if you're really interested in kind of trying at multi-perspective in a longer series. This is something I really feel like really gives you a taste of that and does it very successfully. This is also just a very entertaining series. It's full of romance and adventure and betrayal and politics and all things that way. I feel like Morgan Rose very successfully combines the storylines of all of the characters that you read from in a really interesting and cool way, and I just feel like this is a really good book series to start with. And the last fantasy book recommendation I am going to suggest is actually an adult fantasy book. This is for people out there that are intimidated for whatever reason into jumping into adult fantasy, be it the length, be it the perceived perspective of it being really complicated and hard to follow. This book is not only amazing, one of the best books written ever, but is incredibly easy for anyone to read. It's just so dang good that everyone just needs to read it, and that is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. A lot of people I feel like are very intimidated by this book. I see this a lot in comments, but I'm here to tell you this is actually one of the best books to start with if you want to get into adult fantasy, for a few reasons. One, it namely follows one perspective, and that is our main character Kvothe. We follow him from a young boy to becoming an adult, and we see him go through lots of things, from going to school, learning about magic, going on adventures, but for the most part, the plot and the world is very much contained to Kvothe, our main character. I don't want to use the word simple, but it definitely keeps the world much more easy to follow and perhaps a little more linear. On top of that, this is a beautifully written fantasy book. It's not dry in any capacity. It's very lyrical. It's definitely a story that makes it easy for anyone to fall into, even if they don't generally read fantasy on a regular basis. This is just one of the most prime examples of amazing fantasy literature, but that I also feel like is incredibly approachable and should be read by everyone. So don't be intimidated by this. It's long, but honestly, that just makes it better because that means you get to be with the characters for longer. So that's how I feel about that. Alrighty guys, those are my beginner fantasy reading recommendations. Let me know down below some books you think are a really good place to start with fantasy, as I would love to know, and I perhaps will want to make a part 2 of this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative or helpful in some way. I really enjoyed filming it. I always love talking about fantasy. But anyway, I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye!